Here's the question that comes up more often than any other question in gardening. It goes something like this. The eggshells get saved, they get dried, they get worked into the beds every spring, and nothing happens. What's going wrong? And it's a fair question because eggshells are one of those pieces of advice that have been passed down for generations. Grandma did it, her mother did it. Open almost any old gardening book and somewhere in there is a line that says, save your shells, bury them in the bed, and good things will follow. So people save them, bury them, and wait for the good things. The good things never arrive. Why? That's what this whole video is about. Eggshells are genuinely valuable material, but only under one condition, that you understand what actually works inside them, when it works, who it works for, and how to prepare them so they start working at all. Because a shell tossed whole into a garden bed is not fertilizer. It's a piece of shell sitting in a garden bed. It can lie there for 5 years and hand the plants nothing. The shell that has been prepared correctly and applied correctly, on the other hand, is a serious tool that changes the outcome of a season. The difference between those two situations is the difference between disappointment and results. And by the end of this, you'll know exactly where the line falls. Start with what's actually in there. A chicken eggshell is roughly 94% calcium carbonate, the calcium salt of carbonic acid, plus small amounts of phosphorus, magnesium, and potassium, and traces of manganese, iron, zinc, and copper. All of that is real. All of that is useful to plants. Calcium in particular is one of the key macronutrients. It builds cell walls. It determines how firm and durable plant tissue is. It affects how other nutrients get taken up, and it plays into the plant's overall resistance to disease. Calcium deficiency shows up in very specific ways that most gardeners have already seen without knowing what they were looking at. Blossom end rot on tomatoes, that dark, sunken, leathery patch on the bottom of the fruit, is almost always a calcium problem. Young pepper leaves that curl and cup, cabbage that dies back at the growing point, strawberries that come out lumpy and deformed. All calcium, and the calcium sitting inside those shells should, in theory, fix every one of those problems. So why doesn't it, in most cases, when the shells just get mixed into the soil? The answer is chemistry. Calcium carbonate is very poorly soluble. In neutral or slightly alkaline water, it barely dissolves at all. A root can be pressed directly against a fragment of shell and receive not 1 milligram of calcium from it, simply because that calcium never converted into a form the plant can absorb. It stayed locked up as carbonate. To free it, you need acid. In an acidic environment, calcium carbonate dissolves quickly and releases calcium in ionic form, which is exactly the form roots know how to take up. In nature, that happens when organic matter breaks down and produces humic acids, when earthworms pull material through their guts, or when the soil itself is acidic enough to do the work. But in the neutral to slightly alkaline soil that most vegetable gardens have, whole shells will sit essentially unchanged for years. Ask around and you'll hear the same story again and again. Someone digs a bed, turns over shells they buried 3 seasons ago, and they look brand new. Exactly. 3 years of sitting there. 3 years of giving nothing back, which is why the method matters far more than the material. There are 3 ways to use eggshells, running from simple to genuinely powerful. The first is the easiest. Shell as a soil conditioner. No chemistry involved, almost no preparation. Dry the shells and crush them, not into dust, but into coarse fragments somewhere around 1/4 of an inch. That crushed shell gets worked into heavy clay soil at digging time, roughly a bucket's worth per square yard. The effect is mechanical and it's the same effect you'd get from adding coarse sand or perlite. The fragments create air pockets, improve drainage, and stop clay from packing down into a brick after every watering. It works slowly. You won't see it this month, but after a season or 2, the structure of a heavy bed is noticeably better. And the shell does eventually break down, slowly, does eventually release some calcium. Not much, but some. Think of it as a long-term deposit rather than a quick return. That same crushed shell is also excellent in potting mix for houseplants, either as a substitute for drainage material or blended right into the soil. For cactus, succulents, and anything else that wants a loose, fast-draining root zone, it does the job well. The second use is protection against slugs and against soil pests like mole crickets. This one is purely mechanical, not nutritional, and it's surprisingly effective. Dry the shells and crush them so you get sharp, jagged shards with ragged edges. Sharp is the whole point. Not fine dust, not neat little squares, shards. Scatter those in a band about 2 to 3 inches wide around the base of your plants. A slug crosses that band on soft, exposed body tissue. The edges cut into it, and it turns around and leaves. There is no poison involved. It's simply an unpleasant surface to travel across. The catch is weather. This works well in dry conditions and much less well in wet ones, because saturated shell loses its bite. As a supporting tactic alongside other measures though, it earns its place, especially around young transplants, which slugs love to strip in the first few nights after they go in the ground. Against mole crickets, the shell fragments go directly into the planting hole. These pests don't like tunneling through soil full of sharp material. It's not a guarantee, but it lowers the odds, and it's an old rural trick that has stayed in use for decades because it works often enough to be worth the 2 minutes it takes. Now the third use, and this is where it gets genuinely interesting. Eggshell is real calcium fertilizer. This requires preparation, and it's the step almost nobody takes. The rule to remember is this: to make the calcium in a shell available to plants, the shell has to be ground to define as a flour and combined with an acid. Then the calcium carbonate reacts, converts to a soluble form, and the calcium becomes something roots and leaves can actually use. And the cheapest acid available to anyone is already in the kitchen cabinet: plain white vinegar. Here's the process. Dry the shells thoroughly, then grind them as fine as you possibly can. A coffee grinder is the right tool. A mortar and pestle works, but the grinder gives you the fineness that makes the reaction fast and complete. The finer the powder, the more of it converts. Take a glass jar or a plastic bucket, not metal, because vinegar and metal are a poor combination. Pour in vinegar, then start adding the shell powder a spoonful at a time. The reaction is loud and obvious: fizzing, foaming, bubbling. That's the acid attacking the calcium carbonate and releasing carbon dioxide. And those bubbles are the visible proof that the conversion is happening. Keep adding powder until the fizzing stops and a little undissolved powder settles at the bottom. That's your signal. The acid is used up, the reaction is complete, and every bit of calcium that could convert has converted. What you're left with is calcium acetate, a soluble salt that plants absorb readily. As a rough guide, a cup of standard 5-press white vinegar will take somewhere around 2 to 3 teaspoons of shell powder before it's exhausted. So if you want a working quantity, scale up in that proportion and let the fizzing tell you when to stop. That liquid is a concentrate and it must be diluted before it touches a plant. 2 to 3 tablespoons of concentrate in 2.5 gallons of water. Use it as a root drench every 2 to 3 weeks during active growth, or as a foliar spray every 10 days, early morning or evening, never in the heat of the day. That is real calcium fertilizer, not shells buried in a trench with hope on top. An actual working solution that plants take up fast. Who needs this most? Tomatoes first and above all. If tomatoes are coming off the vine with blossom and rot, that dark soft patch on the bottom, it's nearly always calcium, or more precisely, failure of calcium uptake. Spraying calcium acetate solution on the foliage while fruit is setting is the most direct and fastest fix available, working in days rather than the weeks it takes for soil-applied calcium to move. Peppers had the same story during fruiting. Strawberries respond very well to calcium while berries are filling. Cabbage needs calcium to form a proper head, particularly the late varieties. There's another method that fewer people know about, and it's simpler than the vinegar route for anyone who doesn't want to work with acid. Call it eggshell tea. Take raw, unwashed, untreated shells, with the membrane still attached and still moist, and fill a large glass jar about halfway. Top it up with warm water, put a lid on loosely so it isn't sealed, and set it somewhere warm for 3 to 5 days. After a few days, the water turns cloudy and develops a distinct smell. That's fermentation starting, and the organic acids produced during fermentation begin breaking down the calcium carbonate and shifting it toward more available forms. There's a bonus too. The inner membrane of the shell contains hyaluronic acid, collagen, and glucosamine along with other biologically active compounds, and these stimulate root development in the plant's own defensive responses. Dilute the finished tea at about 1 part tea to 5 parts water and apply it at the roots every 2 weeks. The smell is unpleasant. Plants don't care, so the membrane stays intact. Now, the other side of the story. We should never get eggshells because for some plants, this is active harm. Shell is alkaline material. As calcium carbonate breaks down, it raises soil pH. For most vegetables, that's fine or beneficial. But acid-loving plants are a different matter entirely. Blueberries are the clearest example. Blueberries want a pH between 4 and 5, firmly acidic. Drop shells into the planting hole and you start pushing pH in exactly the wrong direction, right where the roots live. The plant yellows, sulks, and sets very little fruit. Rhododendrons and azaleas, the same. Heathers, the same. Conifers, in part. Potatoes are an interesting case. They prefer slightly acidic ground, and heavy lime or ash nearby raises the risk of stap. It's not guaranteed, but the association is well documented, so leaving shells out of the potato patch is the safer call. Who does benefit? Tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, cucumbers, squash, pumpkins, every kind of cabbage and brassica, beets, carrots, onions, and garlic. Most flowers, roses, dahlias, peonies, clematis, strawberries, and all the fruit trees and berry bushes, apples, pears, cherries, plums, currants, gooseberries. Rinse them. The moment an egg is cracked, run the shell under warm water for a few seconds to clear out the leftover white, which is what stinks and attracts flies once it dries. Then dry them. A paper towel on the counter or a windowsill will finish the job overnight. Store the dried shells in an open container, a jar with no lid, a bowl, an old pot, not sealed. They need airflow so moisture doesn't build up inside. Once enough has accumulated, crush them. For soil conditioning and slug barriers, a heavy bag and a rolling pin is all it takes. Pour the shells in, roll over them a few times, and you've got the fragment size you want. For the vinegar concentrate, use the coffee grinder, and the finer the better. Grinding a full batch at once and keeping the finished powder in a jar is the practical approach, since it's then always ready. How many shells do you actually need? One chicken egg yields roughly 1/5 of an ounce of shell, so about 20 eggs get you a solid handful of powder. That sounds like a lot until you start collecting consistently. Over one winter, it adds up fast, especially if you ask a neighbor or two to set theirs aside. Most people are baffled that anyone wants their garbage and hand it over happily. Quail shells work just as well and arguably slightly better since they're thinner and break down faster. So those are worth saving too. There's one more use almost nobody talks about: shells in the compost pile. Compost is a living system. Bacteria, fungi, and worms are doing the work in there, and all of them are sensitive to pH. When a pile goes sour from too much acidic input, citrus peels, pine needles, and so on, the bacteria slow down, the pile stops heating, and decomposition stalls. Adding eggshells acts as a pH buffer. The calcium carbonate neutralizes acid and keeps conditions in the range the microbes prefer, and the calcium ends up in the finished compost as a bonus. Just toss the shells in whole or lightly crushed. Worms love them, and as carbonate passes through a worm's gut, it partly converts to more available forms. A process that's been documented repeatedly in vermicomposting research. Seedlings deserve a section of their own, because this is where shell can help quickly and visibly. When starting tomatoes, peppers, or eggplant, mix a small amount of shell powder into the potting mix at sowing time, roughly a teaspoon per quart of substrate. Seed starting mixes tend to run slightly acidic, and a teaspoon of finely ground shell nudges that back toward neutral while stocking a small calcium reserve for the first weeks of growth. Once the seedlings are up and growing actively, start watering with diluted vinegar concentrate or shell tea. Peppers respond especially well because their calcium demand is high in indoor growing conditions. Uneven watering, above all, routinely interfere with calcium uptake from the mix. Along the same lines, crushed shell makes an excellent substitute for drainage material in pots. Normally, the bottom of a container gets a layer of clay pebbles, perlite, or broken crockery. An inch of coarsely crushed shell does the same job. It keeps the mix from compacting, lets excess water move out, and slowly feeds calcium into the substrate at the same time. 3 functions from one material and nothing to buy. Seedlings raised this way tend to come up with strong root systems, dark green foliage, and short, thick stems, all of which trace back to calcium's role in building sturdy cell walls. There's a common misconception worth clearing up here. A lot of people treat eggshells as a substitute for lime when correcting soil pH, on the theory that you can just throw on more shells instead of buying garden lime or dolomite. That's wrong, and the reason is speed. Hydrated lime reacts with soil almost immediately. Dolomite works over 1 or 2 seasons. Whole eggshell works over several years, if it fully breaks down at all. So for fast, meaningful pH correction, prepping a bed, dealing with genuinely sour soil, shell will not get you there. That job needs actual lime. Shell is for maintenance, a gentle, ongoing calcium supply added steadily over time, preventive rather than corrective. Understanding that one distinction will save a lot of frustration. Wood ash is the other classic homemade amendment, and the two often get mentioned in the same breath and mixed together in the same application. There's logic to that. Ash supplies potassium and phosphorus and some calcium of its own, and it also raises pH. Combining ash with shell powder delivers calcium and potassium together, which are exactly the two elements getting drawn down hardest during fruiting. Very relevant for tomatoes, peppers, and squash while they're flowering and setting. But there's a hard rule attached. Never mix ash with nitrogen fertilizer. Ash drives nitrogen off as gas. Apply ash and urea at the same time, and much of that nitrogen simply leaves. Keep them at least 1 to 2 weeks apart. 2 quick questions that always come up. Can shells be fed to poultry? Yes, and they should be. Laying birds need large amounts of calcium to form eggs, and when the feed doesn't supply enough, the hen pulls it out of her own skeleton, which weakens her frame and cuts production. Crushed shell mixed into feed or simply offered in a separate dish solves that. The birds will take what they need. Can shells go in an aquarium or a turtle enclosure? In small amounts, yes, as a slow calcium source and a mild water hardener. It's particularly relevant for turtles, which need calcium for shell development. Drop a fragment in the water and it will dissolve very gradually. It's not a replacement for a proper supplement, but as a supporting measure, it works. Now consider what this looks like over a few seasons in practice, because theory is one thing and the pattern in the garden is another. A grower losing fruit to blossom and rot year after year typically cycles through calcium nitrate, hydrated lime products, specialty sprays off the shelf. All of it works. All of it costs money and requires another trip to the store. The shell root replaces that entirely. Shells collected all winter, ground in March, converted with vinegar, poured into sealed jars and stored somewhere cool and dark. 2 liters of concentrate covers a full season. First application goes in with the transplant water in May, then a root drench every 2 weeks, and once fruit starts setting, a foliar spray every 10 days on top of that. Blossom and rot on a plot like that usually disappears within a season or 2 after having claimed up to a third of the crop on some plants before. The mechanism is no mystery either. Calcium nitrate, the standard commercial answer, supplies calcium in nitrate form, soluble and available. Calcium acetate from eggshell is the same kind of soluble salt, minus the nitrate nitrogen. As far as the plant's calcium uptake is concerned, the two are close to interchangeable. One of them is free. Cucumbers deserve a mention of their own. They want steady calcium during rapid growth, and that need is sharpest under cover, where there's no rain and no surface water carrying calcium into the root zone. Greenhouse cucumbers grown without calcium feeding frequently turn out bitter, with tapered or misshapen ends, both classic signs of disrupted calcium nutrition. Watering greenhouse cucumbers with diluted shell solution reduces bitterness and evens out fruit shape. There's one more angle that usually gets skipped in discussions like this: the connection between calcium and disease. Calcium directly affects a plant's resistance. Cell walls built with adequate calcium are firm and dense, and that density is a physical barrier. A fungal hypha or a bacterium has a far harder time punching through a rigid wall than through the slack, flabby tissue of a calcium-deficient plant. That's a large part of why well-fed plants come down with late blight, gray mold, and assorted leaf spots less often than stressed ones. This does not mean shell replaces a fungicide. It does mean that regular calcium feeding is preventive medicine, not just nutrition. It works from the inside out, systemically, and that makes it more valuable than a simple yield boost. So pull it all together. Eggshells work, correctly applied. Whole shells in a bed act as a slow soil conditioner, a long-term calcium reserve, and a mechanical slug barrier, and will deliver almost nothing in the current season. Shell tea is a mild fertilizer with useful biologically active compounds, ideal for seedlings and root watering. Vinegar concentrate made from finely ground powder is genuine calcium fertilizer, fast, available, and free for tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, and strawberries by drench or by spray. Shells and compost regulate pH and feed the worms. Crushed shell in a pot replaces bought drainage material and feeds at the same time. The rules that make it all work: rinse before storing, crush coarse for conditioning and protection, grind fine for fertilizer. Keep it away from blueberries and everything else that wants acid soil. Don't expect it to do the job of lime, and always dilute the concentrate before it touches a plant. One more situation worth knowing about: shell and transplant shock. When a seedling moves from a tray to open ground, it lands in a completely different world. Different temperature, different air, direct sun, wind. That's stress. And under stress, the plant's calcium demand spikes, precisely because calcium is central to its defensive responses. Spray the foliage with diluted vinegar concentrate 2 or 3 days before planting out, and again right after. Noticeably improves how well transplants take hold. Leaves wilt less. Roots grip the new soil faster. Use a lighter concentration for this than for drenching. About a teaspoon of concentrate per quart of water, morning or evening, never during the hot hours. Fruit trees are worth a few words as well. Apples, pears, cherries, and plums all respond to calcium feeding, and apples most of all. Bitter pit, those small sunken pits with bitter flesh underneath the skin, is a calcium deficiency disorder. An affected fruit looks poor and stores badly. Calcium sprays during fruit fill, roughly July through August at 2-week intervals, go a long way toward preventing it. A mature tree obviously needs far more volume than a tomato plant, so the practical approach for trees is large batches of tea rather than concentrate. Fill a large jar with shells, cover with water, ferment for 5 days, dilute, and pour it over the root zone. Buying calcium nitrate is more convenient at tree scale, but if the shells are already piling up and the goal is spending nothing, the tea will do the job. Which brings the whole thing back to what matters most here. The reason people get disillusioned with traditional methods in the first place. It's simple. The advice gets passed along in its most general form. Add eggshells. People take that literally. They add eggshells. Nothing happens. They conclude it doesn't work. But it isn't the eggshell that failed. It's the method of applying it, and this applies to a long list of old garden standbys. Wood ash works if you know how much and where. Nettle tea works if it's brewed properly. Banana peel works, but only prepared a certain way. The principle underneath all of them is identical. Figure out what in the material is actually useful. Then create the conditions that let the useful part reach the plant. Shell means calcium. Calcium needs acid to become available. Acid means vinegar. Vinegar means a reaction. The reaction produces calcium acetate. Calcium acetate is soluble, available, and effective. That's the whole chain. 5 steps of logic that turn a piece of kitchen garbage into a fertilizer that genuinely performs. Understand the logic and everything becomes simple. Follow the advice without the logic, and disappointment is the only possible outcome. So what's your experience with eggshells? Has the vinegar method ever come up before? Or is this the first you've heard of it? And where do you land on homemade amendments generally? Do you trust them, or do you stick with what comes in a bag? It's genuinely interesting how differently the same material performs in different hands. If this video was useful, leave a like. It matters more than it seems. The more likes it gets, the more people YouTube shows it to, and somewhere out there are plenty of gardeners who've been saving shells for years without ever understanding why nothing came of it. Subscribe if you haven't already, and hit the bell so the next one doesn't slip past. There's a lot more coming on soil, on fertilizers, and on everything that helps produce a serious harvest without spending serious money.